a minute. I don't know how you would characterize the gang leaders who got 13-year-old kids hopped up on crack and sent them out onto the street to murder other African-American children. Maybe you thought they were good citizens. She didn't. She didn't. You are defending the people who kill the lives you say matter.
Bill Clinton on the campaign trail for his wife, squaring off with protesters from the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, they're criticizing the crime bill that he signed in 1994, and of course, he is defending it. Now, that bill has become a campaign issue. Critics, they say it led to mass incarceration of primarily African Americans, especially those locked up for drug crimes. But defenders say it's a lot more complicated than that. A recent op-ed in the New York Times says, quote, critics of the 1994 bill gloss over the hard truth that the good news and the bad news are linked, perhaps because a myth has grown up that the inmates swelling our prison population are drug offenders who pose no real threat to public safety. That is not the case. Only about 1/5 of the people entering prison since the 1990s are in fact drug offenders. Well, my next guest, he knows about that because he wrote that op-ed piece. David Yassky is the dean of the Pace University School of Law, and he helped draft the crime bill when he was counsel to the House Subcommittee on Crime in the 90s. David, thank you very much as always. I appreciate it. And we'll get into in a second some of the criticism that went into this. When you drafted the piece of legislation at the time, give a little bit of an overview, because the original draft was different than the bill that became law because there were concessions.
Well, absolutely, and I'm glad you frame it that way and say, let's start with where the country was in 1993, 1994. You have to remember, in 1993, when Bill Clinton took office as president, there were 11 million violent crimes in that year in the United States, 32 million property crimes, theft and other kind of property crimes. Those are staggering numbers that had never been seen before in this country.
Yep.
And that it wasn't just the individual victimizations. It meant that whole neighborhoods and sometimes whole cities were paralyzed by the fear of crime, and their economies were being killed by the fear of crime. That's a big part of what was driving jobs out of urban America. So Bill Clinton comes in as president. I think responsibility, it would be irresponsible not to. He had a responsibility to say, I'm going to do something about the crime problem.
To that end, among other things, he put 100,000 cops in the street, the COPS program as it famously became known, and also targeted certain kinds of crimes and targeted how they would be prosecuted. Talk about what the aim was versus how it turned out, and even you acknowledged in that same piece I referenced that there has been some imperfect consequences as a result.
No question. So you're right, and the bill did a ton of things. It had an assault weapons ban, which built on the Brady Law, background checks for gun buyers that Clinton had championed and gotten passed a short while before. It had actually a bunch of sentencing reform that reduced some sentences for drug crimes, tried to shift the sentencing structure so that it focused less on drugs and more on violent crimes. It had a lot of alternative to incarceration programs, but the heart of it was saying we need more police on the street, and we need those police to be out walking the beat. Community policing is a phrase people would use. So not just driving around the squad car, but out walking around, identifying the problems that really affect the neighborhood and dealing with them.
And consequently, they were going to lock up more of the bad guys. That was understood when the bill was drafted, when it was enacted.
So there are two things that went with that, or I guess three things. The big good thing is it brought crime down enormously, right? As everyone knows, crime rates across the country, half of what they were in 1993, with enormous benefits. That's a lot of people who have not been victimized, everything from murder to muggings. And I think it goes way beyond that. It's freed up whole parts of cities to live again, to go out at night, to enjoy the parks, and businesses to come in and provide jobs. So huge benefits, but absolutely there have been costs. And
if
now
I can, let me highlight and let you speak to them. One is mass incarceration. The amount of people in prison, I can't even think that the authors who did this ever intended to be that number. And disproportionately, the people who made up those additional prisoners are overwhelmingly black and Latino. Yeah. To that end, there was a competing editorial that came out in the Times today that people may have seen that said the idea that the black communities asked for this, which was part of the response that Bill Clinton said, is misrepresented, because they didn't just want the cops, they didn't just want more people getting locked up, they wanted to improve a lot of people in those inner city communities. They got the cops, but they didn't get the jobs.
Right, okay, so I think there's a lot of truth in that, but there's also some confusion really in that argument that we got to tease out here. So, first of all, put 100,000 cops on the street. Everybody thought, I mean, I just read the congressional record debates on the crime bill before writing this piece. You didn't see a single person say, we don't need more police. Everyone believed you need more police. Now, should there have been, and could there have been in the 2 decades during that time, more focus on let's make sure those police are acting properly? Absolutely. And I think we're dealing with that now, belatedly. To be sure, Black Lives Matter has done an incredible service by forcing this issue into the public debate. And in many cities, there's been an overuse of the stop and frisk technique. Too many young men of color stopped unconstitutionally, made to feel like they are second-class citizens. And that requires reform.
So all in, with the benefit of hindsight, looking back 22 years ago, you think unequivocally this was good legislation for America?
I think it was good legislation for America, and for progressives in particular, because if you're a progressive, you believe that there's inequality in the world that government needs to fix. There's unfairness and problems that government needs to deal with. Now, 1993, large chunks of this country thought, I don't trust government to do a thing because I see the crime, I see the muggings on my street, I see the burglaries on my street, and I don't even see the government dealing with that. How can I trust them to fix health care, which is much more complicated? The Clintons had seen this. Clintons tried to get health care reform passed, and they encountered a public that was deeply skeptical about the ability of government to solve tough problems, in part because they saw crime not being dealt with. I think you had to deal with that to be able to attack and tackle a lot of the more intractable problems that we still need to deal with.
And we're still having this debate 20-something years later, and it's without an end in sight here. Although, as you said, stop and frisk, and some of the elements of that are already being changed, at least in certain communities in this country. David, I certainly appreciate the time. Interesting perspective then and now.
Thank you for having me.
And interesting, it's an issue once again. I get it. You know, there's a debate about how far broken windows should or shouldn't have gone. Certainly stop and frisk, an issue well before even this election came up. But I think people forget just how bad it was, certainly before the early 90s, but even into the early 90s in parts of New York.
Look, absolutely. I grew up in the Bronx in the 80s. I was born in the late 70s, grew up in the Bronx in the 80s and 90s. I remember how New York was. And it's certainly, like, there's no argument that crime bill made the difference in terms of how cities were able to fight crime. Now, the unintended consequences, the people of color were incarcerated at massive rates. Sure, you can add that conversation to the argument, but in addition to that, you have to understand that people in minority communities and black and brown communities were asking for more police, were asking for protection too, because nobody likes, no citizen, no average working citizen likes crime in their neighborhood, no matter what color you are.
And it was interesting, I learned from this, Andrew, it wasn't that people were shocked afterwards what happened with the incarceration rates and where the policing was being targeted. They said at the time, but of the Black Caucus, which counted 36 members at the time,
Two-thirds of the Black
two-thirds went along with it, but they said, where do you think these cops are going to be? They're only going to be patrolling our neighborhoods, and it'll be safer, but there'll be a price.
Look, times change, and this is difficult for people with long political records like Hillary and Bill Clinton. Think back to the 90s, Defense of Marriage Act, or Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the military. Policies that most people would find abhorrent today, but were actually popular there. The issue isn't that they supported them back then. It's the question of what they really think back then and what they really think today. Are they acting and taking these positions because they believe them to be correct today, or is it the sense of political opportunism that the Clintons always seem to put themselves first and fall on whatever side of the line?
Okay, but what about the counter which says, listen, back then we had a Republican Congress. We had to make trade-offs, but that's part of being in government. That's part about being a leader. You have to make certain compromises, but compared to doing nothing, wasn't this an improvement on safety in communities? We don't live in ivory towers where everything always can be exactly the way we want. That's the argument I think that's been the thread throughout this whole campaign. You know, be great, you know, Bernie, if everybody got to go to college for free. But why don't we do what we can rather than just this, you know, theoretical dream?
Except we don't seem to be in an era right now where compromise is really that welcome on either side, whether you're talking about the Democrats or the Republicans, and you're seeing that in the primary process. And look, the Clintons, Bill Clinton was telling a harsh truth to the people who were protesting there. And it's one of those deals where he might have gotten in trouble for telling the truth. Yes, I think he was accurate with what he said, but you don't score a lot of political points by telling people they're wrong.
He didn't get crushed for it, though.
No, certainly. I agree with Andrew. That statement that he made about, you know, you're protecting the same people who killed the lives that you care about, that certainly is true. Absolutely is true. I mean, and as I said before, the people who were victims of the crimes are people who in poor communities, people in minority communities. They were more likely to be victims, and the crime bill did help that. So I think at the end of the day, that's going to be what's decided on. And I think Hillary Clinton, I don't think that's going to trouble her much. She's still going to get support from the black community.
Really interesting that it's an issue once again in this campaign. All right, coming up next, we're going to take a look at some hot button issues, including some interesting statements on women in combat, controversial religious liberty laws, and the heroin epidemic.